So let's get right to the most interesting point. How is it possible for Trump to get away with all the alternative facts and all the lies? And I asked the people actually to send me in many questions that they want to have answered to this course, to Donald Trump's course on manipulation. And people did so and sent me over 300 questions. And this question was the most frequent one. How does he get away with it? And actually, if you analyze that, that's much more sophisticated than you think, but it's also very interesting to analyze how he does that. If you analyze any of the statements that Trump does, they always lie on a spectrum. So it's not always right what he says, but it's also obviously not all wrong that he says. It's not all lies, all alternative facts. And the website politifact.com has actually very nice names for this spectrum of the evaluation of his statements. So the best way, of course, is that his statement is true, that lies on one end of the spectrum. A statement can also be mostly true. It can be half true and half false. It can be mostly false. It can be simply false, or the worst category is pants on fire, so completely super false. So how does Trump do it? How does he manipulate us? The best way is to look at one famous example, namely his notion that he was actually opposing the war in Iraq, or in his own words, "I was against the war in Iraq from the beginning, believe me." Trump's manipulation strategy is very sophisticated. So let's have a look at one video that is from the presidential debate of Trump versus Hillary Clinton in 2016 and analyze it step by step. There is going to be 7 steps of analysis, and they reveal really a lot of how Trump does it and how sophisticated his techniques are.
I did not support the war in Iraq.
2002.
That is a mainstream media nonsense put out by her, because she, frankly, I think the best person in her campaign is mainstream media.
My question.
So in this first section, in this first step, Trump is doing 2 things. Thing number 1 is he's discrediting the media, and thing number 2 is he's blaming Hillary for that. And the first thing, discrediting the media, is something that he does all the time. Mainstream media is for him fake news. All that the media reports is actually wrong. So in case the media reported that he supported the war in Iraq, it automatically turns into a lie. That's a very, very nice trick, discrediting the media, and we come to that in depth in the further lectures. The second trick is to actually distract from him and to say that Hillary, another person, was to blame, and Hillary started all this nonsense. And this technique of distraction, this red herring, we also are going to cover in the further lectures. And this was just the first step. Let's continue with the second.
I was against the war. Wait a minute. I was against the war in Iraq, just so you put it out.
The record shows otherwise.
The record does not show that.
Why is your judgment
The record shows that I'm right.
In this second section of the video, Trump again does 2 very important things. First of all, he interrupts the interviewer. So the interviewer cannot really say what he wants to say. He interrupts him, he cuts off his speech, and interruption is also one thing that we're going to cover much more in depth, but obviously he's dominating the dialogue, and he is the one who sets the scene. The second thing is that he's super self-confident. So he simply repeats what he wants to say, and he says, "The record shows that I'm right." He has no proof, but he simply repeats this thing. And this trick of repetition, or constant repetition, actually has also a very strong effect on us, because a person who always repeats the same thing, some people start actually to believe that. Let's go to the step number 3.
When I did an interview with Howard Stern, very lightly, first time anyone's asked me that, I said, very lightly, I don't know, maybe, who knows, essentially.
In step number 3 in this video, Trump also uses a wonderful trick, the trick of ambiguity, where things are not said clearly, but very, very blurry. So he quotes himself in an interview, and in this specific interview, and I will put a link under the video so you can listen to it yourself, Trump says to the question, "Do you want to invade Iraq, or do you support it?" He answers, "Yeah, I guess so." And obviously, "yeah, I guess so" is not the thing that maybe, well, I don't know. So that's not the same thing that he's talking about in the presidential interview, but he tries to cover it up with very, very blurry words that he was not saying, yeah, I guess so, we should invade Iraq.
I then did an interview with Neil Cavuto. We talked about the economy is more important. I then spoke to Sean Hannity, which everybody refuses to call Sean Hannity. I had numerous conversations with Sean Hannity at Fox, and Sean Hannity said, and he called me the other day, and I spoke to him about it. He said you were totally against the war because he was for the war.
In this step number 4, Trump is doing another very smart thing. He's talking about a reporter, Sean Hannity, from Fox. And this reporter and him allegedly had lots of conversations privately about the war in Iraq, and privately Donald Trump was saying that he's against the war and this reporter was in favor of the war, and they had struggles. And the very smart thing about that is that first he says nobody wants to call Sean Hannity, so people don't want to know the truth that Trump is supporting, but also these conversations are not on record. These were private conversations between one Fox News reporter and Donald Trump. And also what you might want to know is that this reporter actually is a political advisor to Donald Trump. So the credibility of these conversations that he probably or most probably did not have are really, really low, meaning that it is a wonderful thing that Donald Trump uses that's not possible actually to address, and that's not possible to find out, and probably this is something that never happened.
And then they did an article in a major magazine shortly after the war started, I think in '04, but they did an article which had me totally against the war in Iraq.
In this step number 5, the trick that Trump uses is that he mixes up the times. He says that this interview where he was against it in the Esquire magazine was shortly after the war, when in fact this interview was 18 months after the war in Iraq, and it was a common understanding in those times in the fall of 2004 that the invasion of Iraq was a complete failure. So here Trump says something that's partly true, so he was opposing the war in Iraq, also partly true that it was after the invasion, but not shortly after the invasion, but after 18 months where everything was a complete mess and everybody was agreeing to that.
And one of your compatriots said, you know, whether it was before or right after, Trump was definitely, because if you read this article, there's no doubt.
In this step number 6, Trump does again a very nice linguistic trick. He says, one of your compatriots said that whether it was before and after the war, and then he continues talking, he was clearly against it. But actually, this is not true, because it really does matter what he said before the war. He always replied during Republican debates and during the presidential debate that he was against the war in Iraq before the war started, and now he tries to muddy the waters and says, wait, does it matter if I say it before or after the invasion? The most important thing is that I said it. And actually, he tries to confuse us what and when he did say or has not said. And now we're coming to the last step, step number 7.
But if somebody, and I'll ask the press, if somebody would call up Sean Hannity, this was before the war started, he and I used to have arguments about the war.
And at the end, at step number 7, Trump again refers to the conversations that he had with his political advisor, Sean Hannity, that no one can prove or disprove because they were private. So all in all, the conclusion is that Trump is very sophisticated when it comes to lying and using half-truth statements that are partly false, statements that are temporarily false, that are put in a different date, and it's actually very confusing if you do not know the facts and if you actually do not know the full story. So the conclusion is, already after this first lecture, in a very brief overview, that Trump is a master manipulator. He really knows what he's doing. He really prepared himself to say what he's saying because it's really, really smart and educated what he's doing. And what makes it really difficult as well to find out for normal people, standard people who watch simply the TV show or who watch the presidential debate, is that he does all of that without any doubt. He is super self-confident, or in his own words,
well, I have much better judgment than she does. There's no question about that. I also have a much better temperament than she has. You know, I have a much better.
So, besides what he says, it's really important to analyze how he says that. And we're going to do so right at the beginning of the next section, where we're going to talk about the psychological tricks. One of them is the self-confidence. Second of it, strong body language, strong voice, and all the other things that Trump does. And in the next lecture, you're going to find out what kinds of manipulative techniques, what categories of tricks Trump is using.